welcome today's collaborative webinar with the Float Tank Association and Justin Feinstein, founder of the Float Research Collective. Please add your questions to the chat as we go along. Justin will have a presentation and then leave some time for Q&A at the end. A little bit about Justin. Again, my name is Woody Chook. I'm the executive director for the FTA. I work behind the scenes just along with two staff members to keep the FTA going administratively and just allowing the structure to be there for the board to do things like collaborate with Justin and the Float Research Collective. As you all know, Justin's a clinical neuropsychologist and founder of the Float Research Collective. His research explores fear, anxiety, interoception, and the therapeutic potential of flotation-REST. I'm sure many of you are familiar with him. Today we'll hear updates on Maui Calm, Project Arcturus, explore the evolving role of flotation-REST in mental health, and get a preview of Justin's appearance at the 2026 Float Conference. Justin, thank you for joining us. Thank you everyone for attending, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks so much, Woody. I'm really looking forward to this year's Float Conference. I hope all of you will be there. It's going to be a great conference, and in fact, I was talking to Matt Beck the other week, and we have some exciting ideas for my presentation this year about a new paper that is going to be published, hopefully in the next month or two. It just got accepted a week ago. I'm not going to reveal any surprises yet, but at the conference, I will sort of dive deep into the new publication that's coming out, and I think it's going to be very interesting for a lot of you, especially those of you who care about altered states of consciousness. So I'll leave that there. But what I would like to spend a little bit of time on is talking about what the Float Research Collective has been up to lately and give you a few updates. I'm also going to make sure I leave some time at the end so we could have some Q&A and discussion on all of these points. Now, it's very fortuitous. I didn't realize this when I scheduled this webinar originally, but today is the World Blue Mind Day. And this was a day created by my friend Wallace J. Nichols, who is a marine biologist and who sadly passed away a few years ago. He wrote the New York Times best-selling book, Blue Mind. I encourage all of you to read it because I think it dovetails perfectly with everything we do in the flotation industry. And today is really a day to appreciate the power of water for our physical and mental health. And it could be as simple as what Jay would say, getting near, in, on, and under water. And in the book Blue Mind, Jay talks about this extensively. Just the mere presence of water, even the sight of water, could induce this physiological relaxation response.
From their church too, and old students and everything.
Oh, somebody's not muted.
I got it.
So I want to honor my friend Wallace J. Nichols, who's no longer here with us, sadly, but the Blue Mind Day is today, and hopefully all of us could either go in for a float today, if possible, and really appreciate the healing power of water. The other person I would like to commemorate is another great friend of mine. This is Colin Stanwell Smith from Floataway, who sadly passed away earlier this year. Colin was really one of the most brilliant engineers I've ever met. He designed my entire laboratory at the Laureate Institute for Brain Research. He actually lived with me in Tulsa, Oklahoma for over half a year as he was building my laboratory. And we've become really close and great friends over the years. We knew because of health issues, his death was imminent. And so luckily last year I was able to go visit him in Europe and say my goodbyes to him and really explain to him how much I appreciated everything he did for us. And it was really sad to lose him. I went to his funeral earlier this year, and because of his son, Toby Stanwell Smith, who's in this picture here, Toby was able to bring Colin's work to fruition. Toby was the key engineer responsible for essentially engineering the Maui Calm project. And for those who don't know about Maui Calm project, this was a really difficult undertaking. We were trying to create a mobile float facility inside of a shipping container, and each container holds three different open float rooms. So to get all of the materials and the engineering that it took to actually get the plumbing, the HVAC, the electric, all crammed into a 40-foot shipping container was really incredible. Toby helped bring this project to the finish line in the aftermath of Colin's passing. And so I owe a tremendous debt of gratitude to Toby, to Colin, and in fact to the entire Floataway team, because we wouldn't have been able to get Maui Calm project to the finish line without them. And luckily, we were able to finish the float facility. If you want to learn more about the Maui Calm project, you could go to our website, mauicalm.org, and learn more about it. But this is really going to be the first real world test of floating in a disaster situation. For those who don't know, Maui several years ago had the deadliest wildfire that had ever been encountered in America in the past 100 years. And there's still a lot of people suffering on the island, a lot of PTSD. And we got a grant to provide floating completely free of charge to the entire community of Maui. And so we're really excited to get this facility up and running in Lahaina. It's been a long haul to get it to this point. And currently we're trying to ship it here. Unfortunately, we learned this in the past 2 months. There have been all these new tariffs that have dropped. And I'm working with a team of lawyers right now to sort of decipher how we could overcome some of these tariffs. But it's quite substantial, just so you guys understand. The tariffs that have impacted this project are now at the tune of over $100,000. So this is a giant amount of tariffs that were completely unexpected. And we're trying to overcome this right now with some lawyers who are helping out this case pro bono, because this is a nonprofit mission. And so the hope is we're going to be able to resolve this tariff situation quite shortly and then get this over to Maui ASAP. And I'll keep everyone posted. If you'd like to sign up on our website for email updates, just go to mauicalm.org and put in your email address, and you'll be the first to know when this arrives on island. Now, to kind of step back a little bit and give people an overview of the mission of our nonprofit, the Float Research Collective, it's quite a grandiose mission. When I launched this nonprofit in earnest at the 2022 Float Conference, the overarching goal was really to make float therapy accessible for everyone. I've been publishing data now on floating in different clinical populations who suffer from various mental health issues. For over a decade, we've found amazing results. We've published those in great peer-reviewed medical journals. And now we're trying to take this to the next level. How could we help make sure that these patients could actually afford to float and have the ability to access floating on a regular basis? And so that was really the mission of the nonprofit, is we're trying to get flotation therapy accepted as a medical treatment. And we created sort of a multi-tier approach to getting to that point of medical approval. This is going to take a long time. I'm guessing the time horizon for this could be upwards of a decade or longer. And earlier this year, actually at the end of last year, we hit our first goal, which was Project Arcturus. We were able to raise $150,000 through the generosity of quite a few float centers who have been contributing on a regular basis to the nonprofit in order to create the first cloud-based platform that will allow us to collect publishable data from float centers around the world. This was super exciting. And if you'd like to learn more, you could go to our fundraise site, which I just put in the lower right-hand corner there. But the idea of Project Arcturus was always central to the nonprofit, which was, let's take the collective of all of these float centers around the world and try to understand how floating is helping people. And it's really going to be a seminal study. In fact, it's going to help us understand what are the research projects that we should be pursuing in the coming decades. And it's really going to help us hone in on those clinical conditions that we think floating is having the biggest impact on. You know, a lot of my research in floating dealt with things like anxiety disorders, PTSD. So it was really focused on stress and anxiety. But it turns out floating could have impacts that go way beyond that. And that's what Project Arcturus is about, is really trying to understand the full range of clinical benefits that floating is helping people with in the wild. And for those who are part of the study, you've probably heard about this by now, but for those who are not, we were able to launch earlier this month on July 11th. We officially launched the study across the USA and Canada. We currently have 60 float centers in the USA and Canada actively collecting data. I just checked the report last night. We already have over 60 participants who are in the study, which is incredible. Just to give you guys a sense of this, my first float study that I published back at the Laureate Institute had 50 participants, and it took us about, I think, 6 or 7 months to recruit those 50 anxious participants for that first float study. And the fact that we already have 60 subjects in Project Arcturus within the first 2 weeks is incredible. This is exactly what I was hoping for when we created this cloud-based system. And I'm excited to see where this all leads. I want to take a moment to acknowledge the incredible support team that brought this project to life. And in particular, Brad Dock and Lauren Cook, who have done an amazing amount of work in order to organize all of these different float centers from around the world. It was quite an undertaking, I have to say. But now that we have this infrastructure set up, now that we have this wide network of float centers around the world collecting data, I think it's going to be the gift that keeps giving. And we couldn't have done this at all without this amazing team. In addition to this team, we also have a research committee that's been volunteering their time to help us develop this study. A lot of the people on this committee, especially Mark Whitman, Dr. Fine, Dr. Kalsa, Dr. Regente, these are people who've published about floating tremendously over the years, and they're really trying their best to help make sure this is the best possible research study that we could have created. And we're going to continue iterating this. This is just the first phase of Project Arcturus. So just to give you guys a little overview, I've always envisioned the FRC as a collective. It's a collective of float researchers who are helping guide the research, a collective of float centers helping the researchers collect data and answer important questions, and a collective of peer-reviewed research and science on flotation therapy. And the idea was to really try to use this committee, all researchers who have published peer-reviewed papers about floating, in order to advance the science, but importantly, to use much larger sample sizes and to use diverse real-world populations from around the world, not just, for example, my former laboratory in Tulsa, Oklahoma. So the idea was to have a much larger sample size, a much more diverse sample. And that's exactly what we're doing with Project Arcturus. The committee is also helping ensure that the study design and questionnaires are optimal, and we're actively planning for future float studies and, importantly, grants to keep this research going. So let's discuss just a little bit about Project Arcturus. For those float centers who are part of this, you've probably heard this before, but for people who haven't, I want to give you a nice overview of what is Project Arcturus. What are we actually collecting? So this is going to be a landmark study that's going to help shape the arc of future float research, and it's really going to provide our nonprofit with the North Star for where we should be focusing our research efforts. This is going to be the largest float study that has ever been conducted. Our goal is to have over 1,000 participants by the end of this study, and I think we will reach that goal. And just to give you a sense, in the prior half century of float research, no studies have had over 100 participants. So the fact that we're about to have over 1,000 participants, an order of magnitude larger than any prior float study, I think is a major accomplishment within itself. And this is the type of research that I think is going to be necessary in order to get the medical community to take our modality seriously. And that's always been a primary goal of the nonprofit and of my own undertaking. I really think this is a serious clinical tool, and we just need the powers that be to understand that. And this is the type of research that will help. This is research that's being conducted in approximately 100 float centers across the world. And this network of float centers is going to be part of this for both this phase of study, but also in future phases of the study. Currently, we have representation from 10 different countries, including USA and Canada, but also the UK, Ireland, Australia, New Zealand, Germany, Austria, and Finland. We're trying to expand that representation to other countries. One of the limitations is all of our research right now is in written English. So if English is not your primary language, and if you're not fluent in written English, that is a limitation. It's very difficult to create the actual experimental design and translate it into other languages at the moment. In the future, we would like to be able to do that, but for now, we're really focusing on English-speaking countries. And on July 11th, we were able to launch this across USA and Canada. We're actively working right now with the IRB in Australia and also in the United Kingdom to try to launch those countries next. I'm hopeful that by the time of the Float conference, we will have some positive movement in those other countries. But for now, we're really focused on USA and Canada. And assuming we can reach our goal of over 1,000 participants within this first year of the study, I'd actually like to have our first paper published in a really good medical journal by the following year, so 2027, 2028. And in terms of research, this is actually extremely quick. Just to give you a sense, in a couple of our float studies, by the time we started collecting data, finished the study, analyzed the data, and published it, we're talking about a 5-year or even longer window of time. So the fact that in 1 year's time we could collect data and then publish it the following year, this is one of the beauties of doing this sort of decentralized data collection. And that's also one of the beauties of having this amazing network of float centers from around the world participating in the study. So this is true citizen science, and we're taking it to the next level with Project Arcturus. So what are we actually measuring? So in this first phase of Arcturus, we're focusing exclusively on regular floaters. These are customers who float on at least a monthly basis. So some people might be floating on a weekly basis, others might be floating on a monthly basis, but we're looking at people who are floating really regularly, and they're paying to do it, right? And it's not trivial for those of you who have memberships, right? These are people who are investing quite a bit of money every month in order to float on a regular basis. And we're trying to understand why. Why are people doing this? And so this large global sample will allow us to discover the full range of clinical and non-clinical indications that floating is regularly being used for out in the wild. And that to me is really the quintessential element of Project Arcturus. Now, it's very clinically focused because we're trying to understand the medical benefits. And so in particular, we're asking what are the clinical symptoms and conditions that positively respond to float therapy, and for approximately how long do those benefits last? We're also trying to understand what is the ideal dose for floating. Part of the medical community, this is, obviously Western medicine, but they want to know what is the right dose. And we don't have a good answer to that question yet. And I'm hoping with this sample, we're going to get a much better sense of what is the ideal dose for floating. And we also have some questions in the survey that ask, how often would people float if there were no constraints? Imagine if time and money were not a constraint. How often would people be floating? And that's another thing we're trying to understand. I've had this in a lot of my research studies, but I've had patients who are on a lot of different medications. Some of these medications are highly addictive, and I want to understand how many people have been able to reduce or eliminate taking those medications because of their float practice. I've seen, for example, patients in my study who were taking benzodiazepines, which are a highly addictive anti-anxiety drug. And because they started floating regularly, they were able to stop taking those medicines. That's amazing to me. I've seen the same anecdotally in chronic pain patients who were taking opioids, and they were able to get off their medication because floating was able to reduce their symptoms sufficiently that they no longer needed those drugs. So we're going to learn about that in this study. And then importantly, one of the questions I get asked all the time by my colleagues in medicine is floating safe? And all of our research that we've published to date has resoundingly answered this question as a yes. It's very safe. In fact, it's in my opinion, one of the safest medical interventions out there. We haven't seen much in terms of side effects at all. But in this sample, we're going to have people who floated hundreds and even thousands of times. And we're going to try to figure out, have any safety issues come up over the course of all of these different float sessions. And in this particular study, this first phase, it's just a simple study. It only takes about an hour to fill out all of these questionnaires, so it doesn't take a lot of time or effort on the part of the participant. And we're going to be able to answer all of these questions by the end of the study. So this first phase of Project Arcturus, I think, is a critical first phase. It's going to provide a proof of principle that we're able to collect all of this data at all of these different float centers around the world. And then we're already planning for phase 2 of Arcturus, which probably won't start till next year or the year after. But just to give you a sense of what phase 2 might look like, we're going to ask, can we actually replicate prior experimental research, where we're actually going to have people fill out measures before they float and then right after they float, but at a massive scale. And we're going to look at things like the state anxiety reduction that I found across all of my research, the enhanced interoceptive awareness, the fact that we were seeing effects over 48 hours later after a float. We're going to be able to do that in this second phase of Project Arcturus. So for those float centers who haven't signed up yet, we are going to be doing this study well into the future, and there is still time to participate. Now, which health conditions are we targeting? In this initial study, we actually decided not to focus in on one or two different types of health conditions, but rather to spread a wide net and look at the whole range of different physical and mental health conditions that that floating might be beneficial for. And the way we actually did this is we actually did a long a detailed review of the most prevalent and disabling health conditions in the Western world. And we, in the current survey, have over 85 different health conditions spanning mental health, neurological conditions, cardiovascular conditions, respiratory conditions, musculoskeletal and pain conditions, gastrointestinal conditions, and autoimmune conditions. And so we decided not to just say we're only going to look at pain or stress or anxiety, but we're looking at the whole range of various health conditions. And I think this is important because we don't know. We don't know because float research is still in its infancy what the full range of health conditions floating could be benefiting. And that's what this study is going to reveal. And the other point I want to make, and this is important when you deal with things in medicine, is there may be health conditions that floating does not help with or has no real effect on. And that's important to know. If you say floating is just a panacea and it helps every type of condition out there, a lot of physicians and doctors kind of roll their eyes in the back of their head and say, come on, this can't be true. So not only are we going to learn in this study what are the health conditions that floating is positively impacting, but we also are going to learn those conditions that maybe floating is not impacting or maybe having a negative impact on. And so we're taking an agnostic view on this, and it's an exploratory study in that regard. But I think we're going to have a wealth of information by the end of this as to what are the most important health conditions we should be focusing on. The final thing I want to emphasize is we wanted to make sure we were using research best practices. This is so important, you guys. I can't emphasize this enough. When I first came into the float field over a decade ago and tried to study this, there was a project called the Fibromyalgia Float Project, and it did not follow the best practices. And as a consequence, we haven't been able to publish those results. And I was not part of that study. But to me, that was such a missed opportunity because we had great data for all of these fibromyalgia patients. I think we had over 100 patients in that study. And now it's not going to see the light of day because we didn't follow the research best practices. Now, I was not part of that, but I know the people who were. And I said, what we're going to do with Project Arcturus is make sure that we correct that error. And that's in fact what we did. So this study has been IRB approved by Advara, which is a decentralized IRB. Every participant who participates in this study must sign an informed consent prior to starting the study, and everyone who signs up automatically gets a signed consent form emailed to them. So this is all part of what is required in order to get research published in a peer-reviewed medical journal, and we're making sure that we've done this. And I was very pleased that Advara's IRB has approved this study. We're now working with Australia and UK to get their local IRBs to approve it in those countries as well, and we'll continue forward in other countries. But for now, we have full approval to conduct this research across the United States and Canada. Importantly, all data that we're collecting is de-identified and made anonymous, so people could put in their private health information. They could put in all of the various issues that they've been facing in life, and we make sure that their confidential information is completely protected. On top of that, everyone who's participating in Project Arcturus receives standardized recruitment materials. So every float center is recruiting the same exact way. This includes email messages, text messages, table tents, and laminated posters that you could put up at your float center. And we're only recruiting people who float on a regular basis, at least monthly or more often, either in the past or the present, who are 18 years or older and who are fluent in written English. And so these are the basic elements of the float study. And it was really important that we followed all these elements because we want this at the end of the day to be published in a really good medical journal so that the powers that be will start taking this modality much more seriously. The other thing that the research committee thought a lot about is because this is an online sort of cloud-based study, we're also having to deal with the ramifications of this new world of AI that we live in. And a paper came out at the end of last year that talks about this in great detail, because with AI agents, it's corrupting the online research. In essence, you could have AI bots and agents who are going out and filling out different research questionnaires online, and you're not going to be able to tell, was this a human or was this a machine? And this is a major problem for the validity of research. So we went out of our way to make sure this would not impact our research. And as part of that, we had to create our own app through the XBWell app system. And that is a key part of how we were able to overcome this potential barrier. This is an example of the table tent and poster that float centers who are part of Arcturus receives, but we tried to make the study as easy and as simple as possible for float centers to administer. In essence, you don't have to do anything. You just put up these posters and these table tents at your center, and the participant essentially does the study themselves. So that way, it doesn't create any burden on your part as a float center. You know, obviously, you're doing a lot on a day-to-day basis just to maintain your operations. We didn't want to add anything above and beyond that. So literally, all you have to do to participate in this study is put these table tents and posters up. The participant will scan a QR code that will take them to download our app. You have to create an actual account and verify your email address in order to participate. And then you have to enter in a special access code. And by doing all of these things, we're able to overcome the idea of a bot or an AI agent who's actually completing these surveys. These are going to be real people completing the survey about their actual real life health and clinical conditions. So super easy to administer this study. It's literally a QR code that is all that participants need to access, and then the rest is taken care of. XBWell was chosen very specifically because this was a very secure app that is already collecting data in other research studies. It's HIPAA compliant, and it makes sure that we're able to collect this data no matter where somebody is in the world. I highly recommend XBWell. We've had a great experience with them. Their support staff is incredible. We had an issue that came up the week of our study launch earlier this month, and within 2 days, XBWell resolved the issue. So we've been very, very pleased with the XBWell app and its interface. And this is a key part of how we were able to do Project Arcturus. And then finally, I'd like to mention that if your float center is not currently part of Project Arcturus, but you would like to be, we are going to probably launch a second phase of float centers joining the study later this year. We're not sure when. It might be around the time of Float Conference or even later. But once we get enough signups, we'll probably have a second tranche of centers who will join the study. And if you're interested, we do have sponsorship slots available. There's a form link there that you could, maybe someone could put that in the chat, I'm not sure. But there is a way that you could apply now, and hopefully later this year, we will be able to get your center up and running. So I'm going to stop there. This was a major undertaking for our nonprofit to get this study launched. I'm so happy that we were able to successfully launch it this month. If your float center is part of this study, please go ahead and start collecting data. Like I said earlier, we've already been getting participant data coming in, but now is the moment to reach out to all of those regular floaters, those people who you've known for years or decades that come back time and time again, and tell them, please help us prove that floating is a form of medicine. So thank you so much. I really appreciate everyone's support throughout the years to get this project up and running. And I'll pause there and we could have some discussion, and I'm happy to take questions.
Yeah, Justin, there were a couple questions in the chat that were similar. I think it was both honing in on participants for the project. They said, what about employees of the float centers? Some of them have some employees they feel would fit the
Absolutely.
bill.
So, as long as you meet that inclusion criteria of being 18 years or older, fluent in written English, and having floated in the past or the present on a regular basis, which we define as monthly or more often, right? So once a month, once a week, however often it is, as long as you meet that criteria, your employees or the float centers owners themselves can complete this survey. I met this criteria, so I was able to complete the survey. Um, I think that's the key part. The other element is we're only collecting data right now in the float centers that have signed up for this study. So if you're one of those 60 float centers across USA and Canada, you're eligible to collect data. If you're not in one of those float centers, it's going to be hard for you to collect that data right now. So what I would say in those cases is sign up for our sponsorship program and try to get your center going later this year when we admit that second tranche of float centers.
It looks like, yeah, if anyone has a question, there's another one in the chat. It's a little more general, I believe. It's from Rocky. It says, does dry float have similar mental benefits as a wet float? For example, anxiety reduction, and then do float tanks enhance mindfulness training?
Yeah, so dry floating is I would say, a much newer modality. There were some studies published in the 80s with various variations of that. They've become more elegant, some of the dry floating experiences. And at Laureate Institute, we actually were able to study one of these systems. It's different. That's what I'm going to say to start with. Dry floating is different than wet floating. And one of the biggest differences we see deals with interoception, this idea of being able to feel the inside of your body, things like your heartbeat or your breath. What we found with wet floating is floating actually enhances these interoceptive sensations. With dry floating, where your body is never actually immersed in water, you're completely above the water, you don't see this interoceptive enhancement. And so that's one of the big differences. We do see some elements of anxiety reduction, although not as profound as floating. We do see some relaxation benefits, also not as profound as real floating. But it's a different modality altogether. I've spoken to some of the people in the dry float manufacturing space, and I tried to convey this to them. Unfortunately, they're trying to use my research studies to back their modality. And I told them, you cannot do that because we didn't actually do the study with dry floating. So I think we do have to fight back about that a little bit because those research studies have yet to be done. The evidence base for real floating is far superior to anything that dry floating has. So that's one point that's important to make. The second element of the question dealt with mindfulness and meditation. And I think this dovetails perfectly with that idea of interoceptive enhancement, right? When you're in a real float environment, you're feeling your heartbeat, you're feeling your breath in this very profound way. And that helps with meditation. One of the things that we're looking at in Project Arcturus is how many people are actively meditating while they're floating. This hasn't been looked at before. And can floating actually help train novices on how to meditate, how to attain mindful states? I think the answer is absolutely yes, but we have to prove it with the research studies. And so to me, that's a low-hanging fruit. Floating and meditation and mindfulness is certainly something that needs to be studied. In my opinion, floating creates this amazing bridge to help people access mindful states, something that other forms of meditation are completely missing. And so when I speak to meditation teachers, when I speak to experts in the field like John Kabat-Zinn, this is what I explain. I say floating is not meditation by itself, but it creates this amazing bridge to help teach people how to meditate.
See, there's another question here. It was from Travis Richardson. It was discussed that participating float centers might be able to track how many people have completed the study. Is that still a discussion?
We will have access to that. We're creating a dashboard where we could see how many participants were recruited from each float center. Hopefully later this year, we'll be able to have that available so you could see where your float center is at in terms of participation. And yeah, that's going to be a key thing for our project, because the hope is that every float center who's participating could recruit at least 10 to 20 participants at a minimum. And if every float center who participates is able to achieve that minimum goal, we will hit our overarching goal of over 1,000 participants in the study. So that's going to be really important as the study progresses. And hopefully later this year, we'll have that dashboard up and running.
Does anybody else have any questions, comments?
Yeah, and feel free to unmute yourself if you want to ask the question out loud.
Thank you, Justin, for answering my questions. While I was listening to your presentation, something that came out to me is I think a lot of the float research is trying to focus on marketing. You're trying to get accepted as a mental health treatment. Why? We know that, what's the guy's name? The popular bald guy on YouTube, Joe Rogan. Joe Rogan's a big fan of float tanks. Did you ever contact him or try to show up on his show?
You know, it's fascinating. Crash, I don't know if there's people here who remember Crash, but Crash was a real early figure in this community who created float labs, and that was Joe Rogan's first float tank. And that's where Rogan got his introduction into floating, is back when he was living in California. He would float at Crash's center in Los Angeles. And I became friendly with Crash. And when Rogan moved to Austin, Texas, Crash was supposed to fly out to Rogan's new home and install a float tank for him at his new home. And I'd spoken to Crash about a week or two before this was supposed to occur. And he was going to go out and tell Rogan all about the nonprofit and all the incredible work we were doing with floating and various health conditions, and trying to see if Joe might be able to have a podcast about it. And then sadly, Crash passed away right before he was supposed to go out there. This was, I got to say, really early in the pandemic, somewhere around there. But it never ended up happening. So I'd love to go on Rogan's podcast. Obviously, a lot of people would, because it's one of the top podcasts. So if anyone has any inside connections there, I'm happy to do it. There's other podcasts as well out there. I actually know Andrew Huberman personally, and that could be another possibility. And I think that in general, these podcasts are a great way to kind of get the message out. What I have found, at least over the past year or two, is there's so many different podcasts that I think it's almost information overload for a lot of people. So they haven't been getting the uptake that they got, say, 5 or 6 years ago. But they're still very popular, and I'd be happy to do Rogan.
I have a question.
Sure.
So I like that you explained how unburdensome it is for float centers to partake in this. Could I ask how burdensome is it for the clients? How long does the study last if they were to scan that QR code and start going through the process? I mean, how many floats are they expected? And then are they expected to fill out forms before and after each float, or how does that work? Because I would like to participate and probably put my name in the hat. I do probably have 15 or 20 people I could think of offhand in my float center, but I'd like to be able to kind of ask them prior to it and say, like, this is kind of what the steps are. You're going to have to report in this often, and after every or before every, you only got to do it. If I could, like, just if you could distill that into like a paragraph for me so I could start explaining and see if I could participate.
Yeah, absolutely. For this first phase of Project Arcturus, we try to keep it as simple as possible. So literally, all you have to do is scan the QR code, download the app, and then fill out some surveys that take between 30 to 60 minutes. So you're done with the study within an hour. That's all it takes. You don't have to do any more questionnaires than that, and it's over. So the burdensomeness in this first phase is minimal. Literally within 30 to 60 minutes, you'll be done with the whole study, and that's it. In future phases of Arcturus, which aren't going to launch probably till next year or the year after, we are planning to collect pre-float data and post-float data. And that's going to be a little bit more intensive. That's going to take a little bit more time than an hour, and it's going to take repeated filling out of various questionnaires and surveys. And so in future phases of the study, it will be more intensive, but in this initial phase, it's super easy and it could all be completed in under an hour.
And so I understand all the requirements. Are they doing this filling out of the stuff after they're floating? Should they have had so many floats in, or is this pre-float?
It doesn't matter in this first phase of the study. As long as you're a regular floater, as long as you're somebody who in the past or in the present is floating at least monthly or more often, that's all that matters. You could complete this at home. You could complete this at the float center. Essentially, it's all done on your smartphone. Super easy. You could complete it anywhere you want. You could complete it while you're in the comfort of your own home. So it doesn't have to be done at the float center itself for this first float study. In future float studies with Arcturus, it's going to get more complicated because then you have to complete it at the float center. That's going to be a different iteration, but in this first phase, it could be literally completed anywhere, as long as
How
you have a
many
smartphone.
how many floats should they have had presently if they're just become, because I have this guy, he just discovered floating. He signed up for a membership after his first one, and he comes in every week right now.
Yeah, you would
So,
qualify. You would qualify, and
okay.
we're going to be able to look at that. So we're getting a very clear indication of how many floats different people have. So there's going to be people in this study who floated weekly for decades, but there's also going to be people in this study who floated weekly for just a few months. And that's okay. We're going to be able to actually account for that as we analyze the data. But as long as you're floating on a regular basis, you qualify.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
And to piggyback on that, I think, let's see, Travis in the chat said feedback from his clients at his center said that the app is super easy to use.
Yeah,
And
thanks, Travis. Yeah, we did a lot of research into what is the best interface to do this, and it is very super friendly, super easy to use, and it's mostly seamless. It's one of those things that you have to really think carefully about because you're going to have young people doing this, but you're also going to have senior citizens doing this study. And some of them might not be as apt with their smartphones. So we made sure that the interface is very user friendly.
Alyssa, you have a question?
Yes. Hey, hey guys, I'm Alyssa from Sweet Dreams Wellness in Plain City, Ohio. I have I had a call to follow up with, so I kind of missed it. So I have a low volume of floats. So this could be a really good opportunity for me to really punch in the floats into the community. So I wanted to see a little bit more like, could I start a client floating more regularly with doing this, or do they have to have previous float experience?
Yeah, so for this first phase of Project Arcturus, we're only studying people who float on a regular basis. So if they're floating at least once a month or more, they would qualify.
Okay.
Now, another element of this is because this is a research study, you can't actually incentivize anybody to do it. We incentivize them through our research study. So, for example, everyone who signs up to participate in this study gets their names entered into a raffle draw, and we're going to give out 10 different $100 Amazon gift cards as an example. But no one is allowed to, then this is important from an ethical standpoint, and the IRB takes this very seriously. No one's allowed to say, give out free floats if you participate in this study or incentivize anything else in order to participate. So I think the key part is if you have people at your center who are already floating on a regular basis, they would qualify. And then those who haven't been wouldn't qualify.
Okay. So would that be when when does it start? Like the research is already going on, but when
We started the study this month on 7/11, and we'll continue collecting data for at least a year, if not longer. So one of the things I had mentioned earlier on the call is we are still accepting new signups. There's a link here on the sponsorship form where you could try to sign up your float center for the study. For this, because we already started and because we have this group of 60 float centers across USA and Canada that are already ongoing, we're probably not going to admit the second tranche of centers until later this year,
okay.
probably sometime around the float conference or later. But you could fill out your form and let us know that you're interested, and we're going to get that second tranche of centers onboarded. It takes a little bit of time to get your center onboarded, maybe an hour or two at most. It's not a big commitment at all. But then once you're onboarded, we're going to admit everybody in one tranche, and then you're going to be able later this year to start collecting data at your center.
Okay, that's perfect. That's like perfect timing. So I'll just get to work and spread the gospel about floats and get more people consistently floating, so I have more subjects for us.
Yeah, perfect.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah. Let's see. Other questions. Would it be good to apply now, even if you are in another country? Yes, you can apply now with other countries outside of USA and Canada. We are having to deal with their local institutional review boards, their local IRBs. So if you are in another country, you have to be very patient because we're having to get IRB approval in each of those other countries outside of USA and Canada. But feel free to apply, and then if we have enough people and float centers in those different countries, we will actively try to work with the local IRBs in those countries. Let's see. Another question, are there any float studies you'd like to see beyond the one you're currently working on? Yes, a million. In fact, I was just on a phone call earlier today with a set of researchers in Wisconsin who run an acute trauma center. So these are people who have various forms of acute trauma. They come into the hospital. They're in a state of fight or flight, right? To me, that's a low-hanging fruit. We know through all of my research that floating reflexively reduces hyperarousal, right? It takes somebody in a state of fight or flight and helps bring them back into equilibrium. And so to me, that would be a really fascinating study. And this morning when I was speaking to those researchers, they agreed and they're going to try to conduct that study. There's so many studies. One of the things we're going to learn with Project Arcturus is all the different health conditions that are being or that are finding benefit in the wild from flotation therapy. I can't tell you, for example, how many people I know with various forms of brain injury and TBI who say that floating really helped them overcome their brain injury. Guess what? There's never been a single peer-reviewed study on TBI or brain injury post-float. Another low-hanging fruit. So I think there's so many different research studies that could come out of Project Arcturus because we're going to understand, okay, here we have a cohort of 10 or 20 or 100 people who all have this health condition and are all saying that floating is helping. That's going to be the biggest clue for us as a nonprofit to really hone in and focus on those conditions. Travis just wrote, do you think your app and the way you're conducting the study would make it easier for the way studies in floating are conducted? Absolutely. Now that we've put all this effort into creating this large network of float centers around the world, and now that we have this XPWell interface up and running, I really believe it's going to be the gift that keeps giving, because in the future, it's going to be so much easier to launch a new study. One of the things I was thinking about during the pandemic is how many people with post-COVID issues or even post-COVID vaccination issues could use floating to help. And if we had this interface and this cloud-based system already up and running back at the pandemic, we could have easily launched a post-COVID study and we could have collected data and we could have published it right away, right? That to me is the beauty of this decentralized cloud-based system is we're going to be much more efficient and expedited in future float research because of it. And so that's one of the reasons why I'm so happy that we have this nonprofit and we have this collective of different float centers, because future research is going to become exponentially easier as a consequence. All right, I'm just looking through the chat. Any other questions or points of discussion that people might have?
That's it. Yeah, we can go ahead and wrap it up, Justin.
Great. Well, I hope I get to see all of you at the Float conference this year. It's going to be in September, not August like usual. So be on the lookout for ads. Yep, there you go. It's going to be in Norfolk, Virginia, mid September. I think September. Is it
September 18th.
Yep, September 18th through 20th. It's going to be a great conference this year, so I hope everyone could make it. And I'm hoping actually we're going to have a Project Arcturus workshop that Friday of the Float conference where we could actually unveil some of the initial results that we've gotten from that first set of participants. So really excited for this launch of Project Arcturus. And thanks everyone for joining, and thank you for supporting the nonprofit.
Yes, thank you, Justin. Yeah, thank you everyone who's joined. I've probably been following you for the past 10 years, so I've seen how you've moved the needle, and like you said, it's a slow process, but kind of each year you've taken incremental steps towards the foundation of where you are now with Project Arcturus.
Yeah, thank you so much, Woody, and thank you to the FDA for everything they do. If you're not part of the FDA, I encourage you to join. It's a great association, and it's really important that we have a robust industry association, and FDA is doing a great job.
And yes, we're both working collaboratively to raise awareness in floating, legitimize it, and I guess make it more of a public thing.
That's right.
All right. Thank you, Justin. I will say goodbye to everybody.
Take care, everyone.
All right, friends, have a terrific day. And yeah, wishing you the best. Mark, thank you again.
Thanks, Mark. Good seeing everybody. Take
Thank
care.
you.
Bye-bye.